Hello everyone, it's Lit Lessons with GCSE Memes here, once again with another video for you. Today looking at the historical context behind an Inspector Calls. So the 10 biggest things that shape this text from history. Okay, so I'd like to keep my video below 10 minutes, so I'm going to go straight into this. Alright, looking at the 10 most important things that have shaped this text. Okay, you may need to pause the video a few times just for your revision purposes and to get the notes down, because I'll be going pretty fast, just to warn you. So without further ado, let's get into it. So context piece number 1. Okay, and it's a criticism of capitalism by J.B. Priestley, this certainly, and that is the sinking of Titanic being mentioned in the text. Now, Arthur Burling, before the sinking of Titanic occurred, says, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, and immediately we're meant to see him as being pretty foolish here. But what's interesting about the Titanic is it is seen as a very capitalist invention, and that is pretty evident from some of the information that we see from the text. The idea that, first of all, most of the survivors were first class immediately shows you the inequality that existed on that cruise liner. And the cruise liner itself only existed because of capitalism as well, because it was owned by a British businessman who wanted to produce the best cruise ship in the world in terms of luxury, and that's why it was celebrated by the capitalists. Now, people like J.B. Priestley would have argued that, true to form of capitalists, the businessman cut costs in its building and actually used rivets which were much cheaper, and many believe that that was the reason it sunk in the first place. So J.B. Priestley, by mentioning the Titanic, certainly seems to be criticising the capitalist world around him. That's context number 1. Context number 2 is a celebration of the growing rights of women, and in particular the suffragettes, and they're kind of embodied by the characters of Sheila and Eva. Sheila says, when hearing of Eva's sacking by her father, these girls aren't just cheap labour, they're people. And the suffragettes were at this time fighting for their right for women to vote. And Sheila and Eva come to represent these figures quite evidently. Okay, because they are fighting for equal rights and pay themselves. And in 1945, when this play was written, Priestley certainly seems to be suggesting that still more needs to be done for women's rights. They've made some progress, but more needs to be done for them to achieve equality. So that's context number 2. Context number 3 is where we see a little bit of propaganda from the play, and that's this growing belief in socialism that was existing during this time. And I believe that J.B. Priestley was encouraging the audience to have this belief as well. And Arthur Burling, this very dislikable figure, actually says that Bernard Shaw's and H.G. Wells's should stop doing all the talking. They can't let them do all the talking. Now, these were writers who were very famous socialists. They were committed socialists. And the fact that Burling, this dislikable figure, shows his distaste to them actually makes us want to be more like H.G. Wells and Bernard Shaw and have beliefs in socialism. Okay, and J.B. Priestley himself, being an advocate of socialist beliefs, certainly seems to be producing some propaganda here to get us to believe his political views as well. So that's context number 3. Context number 4 is where the play was first performed. It was first performed in Russia, and that's very interesting because Arthur Burling actually refers to Russia as being behindhand naturally. And why Arthur does that is perhaps because there was a lot of political unrest in Russia in the early 20th century, because they were fighting for equality. They were dead against the inequality that they found existed in that country. And the fact that Arthur seems to sneer and look down upon the Russian state shows you his kind of patriotism, his fascism, but also makes us recognise that he is once again this quite dislikable figure. As well as that, it is no coincidence that this play about equality was first performed in front of an audience who were fighting for equality, or had been fighting for country for a number of decades by that point as well. That's context number 4. Context number 5 is one of the tragedies put upon capitalists and blamed upon capitalists, and that is the world wars. Now, once again, true to form, Arthur with a terrible prediction here. The Germans don't want war. Now, J.B. Priestley seems to be stating here that capitalist countries compete for profits, form the best armies, and try to invade other countries to earn money. And war was caused by capitalists, according to Priestley, certainly. And this is important because obviously it was a huge tragedy, as both wars were. But Priestley himself was a soldier in World War One from 1914 to its end. So he certainly feels like much of the suffering that he perhaps experienced himself was a result of capitalist politics as well. So that's context number 5. Context number 6 then is a new genre that's started to exist during this time, and it's this idea of realism. And we see that in some of the informality in some of the characters, such as Arthur here. Now, realism is a type of play that started to exist more during this time, where essentially the sets and the dialogue between the characters is more everyday. It's more what we'd expect from real life, more realistic. Okay, and we see that in characters like Arthur and like Sheila, when they use words like when they use words like squiffy, which show that Priestley was definitely influenced to make a kind of realist play to some extent, like the other playwriters were during this time. So that's context number 6. Context number 7 is some of the other work that J.B. Priestley did. Now, J.B. Priestley, as we know, okay, was an advocate of socialism, okay, and he actually had a broadcast on the BBC which was rivaled to Winston Churchill's own broadcast. It was on at the same sort of time. It was only second in popularity to Churchill's broadcasts. He was actually taken off the air, though, because many believed that his broadcasts were too socialist, and this was actually done by Churchill's workers. So we can clearly see here that Priestley was writing socialist propaganda quite regularly, and one may argue certainly that In His Spectacles is a piece of socialist propaganda itself. So that's context number 7. Context 8 then, okay, is the worker strikes that were occurring during this time, similar to those we see of Eva Smith. Now, in 1912, there was a miners' strike, okay, so when this play was set, okay, and 14 million working days were lost in the year. Now, strikes during this time were quite often for better working rights and for pay, like Eva Smith's were. And actually, these were regularly quite successful. And more strikes occurred between 1912 and 1945 as a result of this. So people were standing up for their rights as workers during this time quite regularly. So that's context 8. Context 9 then, okay, is how Berling seemed to earn his money, and that's through the Second Industrial Revolution. And what seemed to have occurred during this time, and the reason why Berling and other factory owners like Berling seemed to earn a lot of money, is because there was a second wave of improvements to technology during this time. And this boom in new technology and how things were created in production led to a huge amount of new products and easy money for British manufacturers, because Britain was the leader in industrial production by the start of the 20th century. So that's why he's earned such fast money. Finally then, context 10 is probably the most famous quotation from the play, and it's the idea of labour first being in power and the NHS's creation. This occurred just after the play was first performed, and J.B. Priestley's broadcasts and his literature was seen as a key way that Labour first got into power in 1945, and there was a landslide victory which led to Labour getting into power and then creating perhaps the most socialist thing that still exists in our political sphere nowadays, the National Health Service. And this play being published in 1945, one might argue, may have influenced some voters in their choice of Prime Minister and their choice for a more equal society. So that's the context for you there. I've got some key hints here on how to revise and how to write context, so please feel free to pause the video here and have a read of my example and of some key sentence starters there for you. Now, to finish the day, as always, we have our meme here, and I've chosen a Top Gear meme for you here. Please feel free to comment in the section below anything else that you might like me to do some videos on. Thank you.